Welcome to Grace Sunday Nights. My name is Josh Gallagher, and it's a privilege to have you here. Tonight we're finishing up our series entitled Transformed. We've looked at 6 different areas that God wants to transform in your life so that you can know Him more. And tonight is the 7th and final area we're going to be talking about. But before we jump into that, there's something that I want to briefly discuss with you. In light of what transpired in Paris a couple days ago, I'd like to briefly hit on that. First, I want to make this very clear. My prayers are with the families that won't see their loved ones any longer on this side of eternity. The terrorist attack that was taking place that killed 129 people has yet again reminded us of the reality that we live in. Don't make any mistake about this. The number one weapon that ISIS has is not bombs and it's not guns. It's fear. Because if they can make us fear them, they win. Because when you go into fear mode, you go into self-preservation. And when you go into self-preservation, you know who you're concerned about? You, and that's it. And this is very counterintuitive to what Jesus followers are supposed to be all about. Because God makes it very clear that our lives are supposed to be about Him and other people. And He knew that one of the biggest obstacles to living out our faith would be fear. And that's why consistently throughout the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels, one of the number one themes that Jesus reminded His followers about was the theme of not fearing. We live in a day and age where fear runs rampant, and for good reasons. And I don't think that we should be naive of the fear that we face, but we can't give in to it. And the only way to overcome fear is faith. Faith drives out fear. Because when you have your faith in something greater than another human being, you can face that fear and move through it. But the hard part is, only fear or faith will ultimately rule your life. And as I've been reading reports about what happened and even hearing the news here in the United States, it's amazing how something that happened across the ocean is infecting and affecting so many people here right now. Do not give in to fear. Because if you do, you will not be able to effectively follow Jesus and what He has for you. And ultimately, the goal that they want for us is to live in fear. When I heard those reports, I put a personal stake in the ground, and I said, you know what? I'm going to acknowledge their presence. I'm going to acknowledge their evil. But I'm not going to fear them. I refuse. Because my God said, yes, in this world you're going to have trouble, but take heart, because I've overcome the world. And I'm going to put my faith in that instead of someone that maybe could take my life on this side of eternity. I'm going to put my faith in someone that has me literally for eternity. So in light of everything that's going on in our world, do not give in to faith. Do not give in to fear. Good, I'm making sure you were listening. And we have designed our service tonight a little bit different. Because we want you to walk out those doors tonight filled with faith in a God that loves you, not filled with fear based on what other humans are doing. And we're going to find out more about that a little bit later. But our topic tonight is very relevant to your lives. Because you're going to spend 21% of your waking hours from the moment you are born till the moment you die doing this. But sadly, 70% of people are actually disengaged in this area. Tonight we get to talk about work. That's right. 21% of your life will be spent doing something from 9 to 5 in a job, earning a paycheck. So before we get started, I want you to think about the worst job that you ever had. Think about it. Get it in your mind. Even if it's your job right now. Everyone got it? The worst job I ever had was blowing off ceiling tiles. Those little panels that you see in the air. I spent a whole summer literally blowing those out with an air compressor. I would get a big bundle of them, I would open them up, I would blow them off, and then they would take them in and they would put them in this big reconstruction model that they were doing. It was a horrible job. I hated every single minute of it because it was monotonous and it was boring. Some of you have probably had jobs like that. Maybe you're in that job right now. But if Jesus said, I've come to give you life and give it to the full, do you think he's including that 21% of our life that we will be doing something from 9 to 5? And before I move on, if you're a student, the principles we're going to be talking about definitely apply to you. If you're a stay-at-home parent, the principles we're going to be talking about tonight definitely apply to you. Because Jesus came to give us life and give it to the full. And what we do from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, is included in that full life, even though it isn't a perfect job. I want you to look up here at the screen. And the question is this: what do you see? Don't say it out loud. Most people, when they look at this picture, they see two faces looking at each other, outlined here in the white. But if you focus on the center of the picture and you look at the black, you can actually see the outline of a vase. So how is it that we can look at the same picture but have two completely different conclusions about what the picture is? It's called perspective. Perspective is simply how you view something. And when you look at the exact same picture, you can look at it from two different angles. And depending on what that angle is, that's the conclusion you're going to make about that picture. Here's what I want you to consider. You need to change your perspective on your profession. You need to change your perspective on your profession. And we're going to look at three different ways that you can change this perspective so that you can glorify God and live that full life that he's talking about. The first area comes actually in Genesis. And this is a concept that most people can't believe is actually in the Bible, but we're going to look at it because it's the first thing that we need to change in our perspective about what we do from 9 to 5. Here's what it says. In Genesis 2:15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." In Genesis 1, God creates the world and everything is perfect. Everything that we see was created by God. In Genesis 2, he takes man and he puts him in this perfect paradise where everything is wonderful. And you know what he tells him to do? Work. Work is not from the devil. Work is not evil. We were designed to work. Inside of us, when God made us, he said, I'm going to make you with the ability to produce things. And so get this thought out of your head that work is something to be avoided because it's bad. It's not. We were all designed to work. And even Jesus himself highlights this. In John, he says this. He says, my Father, he's talking about God the Father, who is perfect. He says, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. Now think about it. God the Father, perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, works. God the Son, Jesus, perfect. What's he classify his work as? What he's doing? It's work. And then later in 1 Timothy, it talks about how one day we will rule and reign with God forever. If you're going to rule and reign, guess what? It takes some work to rule and reign. We will be working for eternity, but it will be in the way that God designed it. I will be the first to admit, work has been marred by sin, and so it's not perfect. But in its essence, this is something that God created for us. So the first thing that we have to understand, work is actually from God, and it is part of his design for your life. Don't think it's from the devil, because you were actually designed to do this. The second perspective that we have to look at is when we're working, who is it that we're actually serving? And this is what Paul is going to talk about in Ephesians. Look at this. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Now, before I go on, Paul's going to use the imagery of slaves and masters. A lot of people think that the Bible condones slavery, that it's okay. It's not. In 1 Timothy, it actually puts slave traders in the exact same categories as murderers and adulterers. But what Paul is doing, he's taking something from his culture, the worst possible work environment. And he's saying, even in this, you can have the right perspective on your profession. So if you think you've got it bad, you don't. Paul is addressing slaves in this passage. So if he can encourage them with this perspective, I think he can very easily apply to us. He goes on and he says this, serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Think about this. When was that first big performance you ever had? Maybe it was a band performance, maybe it was an athletic performance. And there was somebody there that helped you get to that point, maybe a coach, a director. But think about that performance. The night of the performance, you did what pretty much everyone does. You look out in the audience and you say, who's here? And you pick out one or two people that you want to perform for that night. And your motivation for playing or your motivation for acting is because you want to please those people in the crowd. And there's nothing wrong with this. But this is the exact same perspective we need to have when we work. Yes, you have a boss. You have someone that you probably work for. But the difference is you're not supposed to be just focusing on them. You're supposed to be focusing on that person who's watching you in the stands, God himself. And so that night when you were performing, you didn't think anything about your coach or your band director. You maybe listened to him, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm performing for this person. We're supposed to work the exact same way because that is who we are serving. So work is from God, and we are supposed to work for God. And you can do this simply based on your perspective. And the third area that we need to change answers one of the biggest questions that Christians have that they want to know the answer to. And we're going to look at what the answer to this question is. It's, what is God's will for my life? People are constantly asking this question, and I love hearing that question because people want to know, I want to serve God. I want to make the most out of my life. So what do I have to do to make sure that that happens? Paul's going to give us part of the answer right here. Look at this. He says, try to please them. He's talking to slaves about their masters all the time. Not just when they were watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all of your heart. Paul makes two very important perspective changes here. First, he says, you're slaves of Christ. Did you catch that? You're not slaves to this person. You're slaves to Christ. Again, that's who you're serving. But second of all, you're doing the will of God. Now, when I think about that, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. How can a dead-end job be God's will for my life? I mean, that sounds pretty offensive if you ask me, that this is actually what God has for me. I don't get it. Neither did I until I started looking back at the jobs that I had. Remember that dead-end job that I had, blowing off ceiling tiles from 9 to 5? One day as I was blowing off ceiling tiles, they came in this big package. And somebody took a permanent marker and wrote the words, "Be faithful," across the front of the package. And in that moment, I realized that God was using that job to teach me how to persevere when things were hard and I didn't want to continue. And when I look back at it, that was a moment in my spiritual walk where things changed. Because I wasn't doing my job anymore for the person. I was doing it to learn more about God. And so, what you're doing is God's will for your life. That's the first thing that I want you to understand. The second thing is, even if you're in a job that you hate to break it to you, God's will for your life is about God, not about you. That's why it's God's will and not your will. If you want to go pursue your own will, feel free to do that. But if you want to pursue God's will for your life, it's probably not going to come exactly the way you want it, because it's not about you. God's will for your life is to know him more and to help others know him more and to ultimately glorify him. It's not about you. So he probably has you in that job right now, or he had you in that job so that others could know about him and he could be glorified in your life, because that's his will for you. I think of Jesus when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he was getting ready to be, I would ultimately just say, ridiculed, mocked, beaten, stripped, and taken all of his dignity completely away. That's what he was facing. And his prayer was saying, God, I don't want to do this. But what does he say? If this is your will, Meaning, this isn't what I want, but if this is what you want, I'm going to do it. That's the perspective that we need to have on God's will for our life. So you might not like it. You might not want to go through with it. But that's why it's called God's will and not yours. So yes, the job that you are in right now, the people that are around you, what you do from 9 to 5 is God's will for your life right now. You want to know the answer to the question, what's God's will? You're living it. What's your perspective? If we change our perspective in these 3 areas, if we understand that work is from God, it's for God, and it's God's will for our life, something naturally happens. And it's so crazy you're not going to believe me, but if you actually change your perspective, it can happen. Here's what Paul says in the next verse. He says, work with enthusiasm, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. When you change your perspective, and this is about God's will and Him working in and through you, it changes everything. Now, I'm not saying we should go around with a false enthusiasm saying, I get to blow off ceiling tiles today. This is going to be great. If you meet anybody like that, slap them, because they're nuts. It's not saying, I love what I get to do. It's saying, I love who I get to serve today. And when you have that perspective, you can walk into any situation enthusiastically because you've got your eyes on someone else instead of just on yourself. Most people get enthusiastic when? Friday afternoon. And the worst part of their week is Monday morning when they wake up. For Jesus followers, I believe we should still be excited for Friday afternoon. Don't get me wrong. That's a great time. But we can also be excited about Monday morning. Because we have the perspective of, guess what? God is going to meet me in this 9 to 5 today. And because of that, I'm going to know Him more. And based on that, I can be excited about what I get to go and do. That's the first thing that happens when we change our perspective. And the second thing that happens is this. Paul says, remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do, whether we are slaves or free. There is going to be a reward when we change our perspective on what we do in our profession. Here's what I like to say. You're already there. You're going to spend 21% of your life doing this anyways. Why would you work for just a temporary paycheck? When you can change your perspective and you can work for something eternal that will be with you forever. And all you have to do is change your perspective. You're already there anyways. And when you change that perspective, you will be more enthusiastic, and there will be a reward that follows it. Do you remember that statistic I told you earlier that 71% of people actually hated their jobs or they felt disengaged? The number one reason was because of the supervisor or boss that was over them. And it's to this group of people that Paul turns his comments next. Check this out. He says, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. So before he goes on, he says, okay, everything we just talked about already, yeah, that applies to you, but I'm going to even give you some more things to think about. He says, don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. I want you to imagine that you're at an elementary schoolyard, and you're watching the kids play for the afternoon. You're in charge. And it becomes very obvious who the schoolyard bully is. He's bigger than everyone else. He walks around with a chip on his shoulder, and you can tell this guy's got an attitude. And so you watch him, and he makes fun of some kids here and there, but at one point, he actually corners this little first grade girl, and he starts intimidating her and threatening her with his words. And you realize that if you don't step in, something worse is going to happen. So you walk over to the bully, you tap him on the shoulder, and when his eyes meet your eyes, nothing changes, but everything changes. Nothing changes because the bully still has the status of being a bully. He still is the same size and still has a little bit of an attitude. But everything changes. Why? Because someone with more authority and power has entered into the situation. And because of that, his actions change. And the face of that little girl that was about ready to get pummeled also changes. If you have anybody under you, at your job, anybody, I have great news for you. You are the bully in this story. That's you. That's a little bit of a joke. It's okay. You don't have to laugh, but I'll keep moving on. You're the bully in this story because you have authority. But every time you exercise that authority, you had better remember who's standing behind you. There is someone who has more authority and more power than you will ever have. And one day we will all stand before him. And remember, he has no favorites. And when you lead and have that kind of a perspective with the people you are over, it will change how you treat them. So if you are over anybody, remember that there's someone greater that's over you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go around and reprimand employees when it's necessary. No, I'm not saying that. I am saying, though, there's a difference when you flex your authority just for your own benefit because you want to show who the boss is. When you do that, you're threatening. If you are a Jesus follower, that is not the kind of leadership you're supposed to have. And if you do have that, you need to change that. You might even need to go to some of your employees and actually ask for their forgiveness for the way you've treated them. Because we are not supposed to threaten those people that we are over. We are there to serve them. So we need to understand that work is from God. It is for God, and it is actually part of God's will in your life. And when we finally understand this perspective, we will change how we view work. And we will start to see that there is actually a purpose in our profession. There is purpose in our profession, that God is trying to do something in and through you from 9 to 5 that he can only do during that time. And so you will start looking for God differently. But in order to do that, your perspective has to change. Here's a quick review of a couple things that we looked at. First, work, it's from God. Second, it is for God. It is God's will for your life. Next, because of that, we're supposed to work with enthusiasm, and ultimately, it brings reward. This is the biblical perspective of how we are supposed to view work. But now let's contradict that with what culture says about work. This is what the culture says. Work, ultimately, it is. It's evil. We are only working until something gets way better, and when perfection comes, whenever that is, we won't have to work anymore. Or next, really, work is just for me. This is all about me. And this is something that's really only been designed by man. This was somebody had a cruel thought and a cruel idea, and as a result, we're just doing this just because. And because of all of those things, you know what? If you want to be a little lazy at work, you go right ahead. Because, hey, everyone else is doing it. Why don't you? And ultimately, it just brings money. It's just a paycheck. So I can ask you this word, what is work? And guess what? It has nothing to do with what you actually do from 9 to 5, but it has everything to do with your perspective on it. And you have two options. You can take the biblical perspective of work, or you can take man's perspective of work. And this is how we can all look at this thing the exact same, but have two completely different outcomes of how we view our 9 to 5. The choice is up to you which perspective you want to pick. There were two men that worked on a dairy. Had the same job, had the same paycheck, had the exact same supervisor. Everything about their job was the exact same. But their supervisor noticed that both of these men approached their job very differently. The first man always got his work done, but he always seemed to just have a frown on his face, and you could tell like he didn't really want to be there. The second guy consistently had this smile, and he also got his work done. And after watching this for a couple months, the supervisor called both men in, and he said, I got to figure out what's going on. So the first man came into his office, and he asked him this question. He says, what do you do here at the dairy? The first man looked at him and says, well, it's very simple what I do here. I do 3 things. I move cows, I milk cows, and I maintain cows by feeding them and keeping them healthy. That's what I do. The supervisor asked me, he says, do you like your job? He says, it's a paycheck. He says, thank you very much. You're doing great work. Keep it up. He sends him out. Calls the second man in. He asks him the same question. He says, what do you do here at the dairy? The man's face lights up. He says, no, you don't understand. This is what I get to do with the dairy. I get to move cows. I get to milk cows, and I get to maintain cows. And I get to meet people. And the supervisor was taken back by his answer. He says, what do you mean you get to? He says, when I milk these cows and keep them healthy, that gives people what they need to seek after God in everything that they do. And when I meet people, I get to share God's love with them while I'm working. And the man asked him this question. He says, do you like your job? And he says, I love my job because I'm advancing God's kingdom through it. If you're a teacher, you're not conveying facts. You're changing the future. If you work in the oil fields, you are not getting oil out of the ground. You are helping people discover that Jesus Christ loves them and he has a plan for their life. If you're a stay-at-home mom, you are not just biding your time until those kids finally go off to college. You're making disciples. You're doing something from 9 to 5, and it has very little to do with what you're actually doing with your hands, but it has everything to do with your perspective. God has put you in this spot for a reason. Don't miss it. It is his will for your life. And it is something that is good. And it's pleasing to him. And because of that, this is our verse for this week. It says, work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. This is the perspective that we need to have. Because there is purpose in your profession. But to understand that purpose, you've got to change your perspective. That this is God's will for your life. It is for him, and it is from him. If you do that, everything will change. But it all starts with your perspective. Let's pray. God, we want to pursue your will. We want to know you more. And you're going to do that through what we do from the hours of 9 to 5. God, we may not like our jobs. We may not like the people that are around us or the bosses that we have, but I pray that by the power of your Spirit, we would have the correct perspective so that we can see you glorified in and through us, and that lives can be changed no matter what we're doing, because this is your will for us. So God, I pray that this week, who's ever willing to take that step and change that perspective, I pray that nothing in their job would change. They would still be around the same annoying employees and maybe bad boss, but everything would change because you would show them very specifically what you are doing in their lives so that they can know you more. And give us all opportunities to share your love with the people around us that we run into from 9 to 5. So God, by the power of your Spirit, continue to change our perspective on our profession so it can be for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.